Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing this morning? Well, I hope. Good. Morning, Niklas.
Morning.
So,
great to be here.
We're here to talk about European tech and the tech scene. So, you guys at Atomico and Slush launched your report today on sort of the state of play, shall we say, for European tech. Can you just give us a quick overview, exactly what some of the stats you found?
Sure. So we thought we should kind of, analyze the state of the European tech system. And as we launched this report, Atomico and Slush, it's called Achievements Unlocked, but not Mission Accomplished. And we did that together also with some great data partners. But what some interesting stats that we saw. And really it just emphasizes that this is the most exciting moment to be in European tech, whether you are an entrepreneur or an investor. And some really interesting things that we saw in the stats, and I think it's available here as well, the report. But this year, 2015, been an amazing year with achievements. We have 10 new companies in Europe that has reached $1 billion valuation. We have 10 billion that's been invested by venture capitalists in the region. There are 5,000 plus angel investors in Europe today. There's 1.6 million developers. So there's some amazing figures. These are figures that I cannot even dream of, maybe 10 years ago. So we've come a very, very long way in the last several years.
Now you just have to look at this conference and how much it's grown to see how much the tech scene here in Europe has expanded in recent years. What is the biggest change that you've seen? Go back to your Skype days to where we are now. That's obviously more than a decade. What is the biggest change that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, the few of you who were at the first Slush, there were just a handful of people. And I think, looking at what's happening today is a good representation of what's going on. These tech ecosystems are now really been maturing. You have places like Stockholm, London, Berlin, which have become very, very strong hubs. But in addition to these hubs, places here like Helsinki, Paris, we see great companies from Madrid, Barcelona, Zurich, Oslo, Copenhagen, a bit everywhere actually. But what's happening now is that you have several successful founders who are going out and reinvesting in the ecosystem, reinvesting in startups. You have people who work for some of these successful companies who learn a lot, and they go out and start companies. And so you have just more and more experience. And then you also have a lot of talent coming from the universities. So today, students, graduates, if you're in like business school or engineering students, are really considering becoming an entrepreneur or working for one of these tech companies as a viable career instead of something like boring as investment banking or management consulting.
Sure. So the idea being that sort of it passes the mom and dad test, right? It's no longer unacceptable to be an entrepreneur.
Yes.
You can go off and do it yourself.
When back in just after 2000 and 2001, 2002, when I started my companies, people were really discouraging you to become an entrepreneur. It's like, really? Are you gonna? It's like, is that going to work? It's like. And it was kind of, your parents probably got really nervous if you want to become an entrepreneur. It's like, really going to leave your job? What about your pension and job security? That's all changed. Today, it's very much acceptable in Europe to be a tech entrepreneur or to work for an entrepreneurial company.
Mm. So obviously, Europe has done quite well for itself in the last couple of years, but by no means, it doesn't compare from a dollar-to-dollar value, perspective to Silicon Valley, because the Valley's been around for so many more decades. So we need to look at what's going forward. What are the new challenges? And you must get this too, but when I travel around, I always often find that the connection between a Helsinki and a London or Berlin are somewhat limited. So can you walk me through exactly, when it comes to building a broader European scene, what needs to get done on combining what's going on here in Helsinki to elsewhere?
Yeah. So it's a very, very different thing going on in Europe compared to US, where everything is very centralized around, Silicon Valley, and then yes, you have, New York and LA and Boston. But we have very much a distributed system of hubs, and they all have their own characteristics. But I spend a lot of my time flying around, all these different places, every week and meeting great entrepreneurs. And what we can clearly see is that we need to interconnect these hubs much more, because it's all about sharing of best practice and ideas, talent. So I think we just need to kind of continue to foster an interconnectivity between the different hubs.
What type of challenges do you see that are similar when you travel around the hubs? I presume similar challenges for a guy or girl in Berlin might be similar going on in Paris.
Yeah, I think, by the way, this is like universal, but the biggest challenge that I'm hearing from companies I'm speaking to is access to talent. That's always the biggest challenge because, talent and experienced talent. The other, challenge, we see when speaking to companies, now we're talking about the companies starting to grow, going past that startup phase, and they have something that works, it's about scaling. It's access to capital. While we have a very, very good supply of seed and Series A funding in Europe, we're certainly lacking behind when it comes to growth capital. So, and to be able to scale these companies to become, global category winners, they need to have access to more capital, and that's one area that's a little bit behind.
Do you find, from your report I saw, that almost 50% of the capital is now going to the top 5 hubs here in Europe? What would you say to someone who's in Prague or Krakow, etc.? Do they need to go to London or Berlin, or can they do it from where they are already?
Yeah. So I think it's great that you're phrasing it like that way, because maybe a few years ago it was always like, should you go to Silicon Valley? And this is a trend that we see, that if entrepreneurs in some places where there's really yet not an entrepreneurial ecosystem, they are considering London or Berlin as their places. Yet I haven't seen any entrepreneur moving to Stockholm or to Helsinki, because it's just a short window when you can attract people here, which is maybe in the summer or now in November. But I think that's a case by case situation, because I think if you're starting a company in a place where you really have no other great companies, it's hard to get access to talent. But then your talent that you recruit, they're going to be more sticky. They're going to stay with you. There's certainly an experience I have. When we were building Skype, when we had our largest office, most of our engineering team was in Estonia. And we recruited like everyone in the country almost who had computer science background. But then people stayed with us because we were the biggest game in town.
Do you also find that because starting a business has the cost of starting a business has dropped so much, and you can frankly do it with AWS and a bunch of other things and get off going with some capital but not so much? You don't need to go where the investors are to begin with. You can get going from your bedroom.
Yeah. So to start a company today is obviously much cheaper. So if you're lucky enough to have some computer skills, and you and your friends, you can start a company with very, very little money and just get off the ground. However, it's when you have that things working, it's about scaling the business. It still requires a lot of capital to grow your company internationally.
Now, you talk about growing a company, and there's been a proliferation of new VC firms popping up and about to be started here in Europe to take advantage of this. But even you say in your report, and you said previously that the growth capital is still an issue. Can you walk me through exactly what that means? I presume it's a question of, fine, you can get money, angel Series A round, but when it comes to really sort of putting the pedal to the metal, it's still an issue.
Yeah. So when we looked at the stats from last year, I think this is in the report as well, seed and Series A rounds in Europe are predominantly done by local investors. I think it's about 80% of those financing rounds are done by local investors. But when it comes to Series B and later, the growth rounds, it's 70% of those rounds are done by non-European investors, predominantly American investors. So what happened is that most VC firms here in Europe are pretty small. They're much well catered for seed and Series A. So when companies starting to grow and need to raise more and more money, they're kind of having to go more and more abroad to raise money. So this is of course one of the things that we at Atomico trying to address and to support these companies as they're becoming, as they're growing to become really big companies.
But I suppose, to be a cynic, is that a bad thing? If I'm a high-growth company looking to raise 40 million, etc., I presume I can go to the best investors in class. And if they're in Europe or they're in the US, does that really matter to an entrepreneur?
No, but when you're starting to scale, you're becoming an international company. and your market becomes global, and your investor base becomes global as well. So it's easier for companies as they scale up to access capital all around the world. So it doesn't prohibit companies to scale, but I think it still will be good for the ecosystem to have more capital. And I think it's also the way we scale companies in Europe, specifically from some of the smaller countries like Finland, Sweden, where we have very, very small domestic markets, we think about global from day one. In the US, it's a bit different because you think about your US market for many, many years, and then you get scale in the US, that's when you scale internationally. So it's the different methods how we scale our businesses, which, by the way, I think increasingly it becomes a competitive advantage to come from a small country, because the world is just becoming more and more global, and if you have that global mindset from day one, it's actually you're better equipped for tomorrow.
So you'd have to look around this room and how the European tech scene has grown quite significantly, but with all the good times, inevitably there will be bad, because that is what the cycle is like. So, not to get too much of a downer here, but when it comes to the inevitable burst of the bubble, because it will happen as it's happened in the past, what is some advice you're giving your portfolio companies to prepare for whenever the water isn't as deep?
Yeah. So I've traveled around the world, and I'm speaking to people every day, and the word bubble is a question about bubbles always coming up. And last week I was in China. And there's a very, very different situation there. And Silicon Valley is also very, very different. So in Europe, I think because we have less capital, it's much more of a, companies here are being built in a little bit more reasonable way. Most companies we see in Europe compared to China and some US companies are much more focused on sustainable business models. What if we don't get access to financing in the next 2 years? And this is something that we certainly encourage our companies to think through. What is a potential downside scenario? What if you cannot get access to capital, in the next several years? What is your plan B? But I think that actually the European companies are better equipped for a potential downturn. And a potential downturn is going to hit China and Silicon Valley much harder than European companies.
Peter, because the valuations are significantly higher.
Yeah, valuations in Europe was last year about half US valuations. So I think if there's a bubble, that means that it's going to be more an equalization, that is bursting, is going to be an equalization of the market.
But I suppose the other question is, you need to swing for the fences, as the Americans would say. It's sort of go big or go home, and you look at the number of billion-dollar-plus valuations in Europe versus elsewhere, but then you look at the 10 billion plus, there seems to be a difference in Europe still compared to China and the US. How is that going to change?
Yeah, so this is a matter of time. I'm convinced that the next 10 years, when we sit here on this stage or another stage, we will talk about several companies here in Europe that has reached double-digit billion-dollar valuations, that are employing thousands of people, companies that have been rolling up other companies. This is what we will certainly need. This is one of the next chapters in the European tech ecosystem story. But this is a matter of time. We really came from nothing in 2002 after the Tom crash. But Silicon Valley has existed for 50 years, and they've been building this over time. So I think we're in a very, very good way. But just as we said in the name of our report, this is far from mission accomplished. We still have a long way to go. I think we are at the beginning of something fantastic. We just need to keep working at it. And one thing I certainly try to do is also to encourage founders to stay on with their businesses, not to look for that quick exit, but just like, what? If you have the potential to build a world-class company, a category winner, you should just stick with it. There's no reason you should not think about exit. You should think about building a fantastic business that has sustainable competitive advantages that can outcompete anyone else. And that's how we get there eventually.
So the question I then ask is, how do we get there? We were talking backstage about King and then their recent exit to Activision Blizzard, and obviously that's a good deal for them, etc. But they're also, that is another European company being taken over by an international company. So how do we get from the point where we are now to where, as you mentioned before, European companies are not only growing to $10 billion plus, but also looking to do their own M&A here in Europe or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think we get there by patience. It takes time to scale business into becoming really, really big ones. And encouraging founders and investors to stay with the companies and not just to sell too quickly. And also, it's about building confidence and role models. Just as the last 5 years have been accomplished by there's a few breakout companies that create role models, and the ambition level is increasing. And I think now there's a few founders who are determined to build their companies to become even bigger. And they just say, what, I'm going to continue to build my company for the long term. I'm not even thinking about exits. So if we, the ecosystem around these companies can support them in that, then I think we're in a good way.
If you were to start a company now, if this was Skype 2.0, whatever we want to call it, what is the, what is the advice you would give yourself? What do you think an entrepreneur, maybe people here who are pitching, need to really think about when they want to grow?
Yeah, first of all, I would say wow, this is I'm very lucky to be living in this time to be able to start a company now. I would also, make sure I get the right people around me, the right co-founders, and the right investors who have the alignment of vision and strategy, and also to think big. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And I would certainly set my company up for becoming an international or global company. And I'll be, of course, very, very focused on creating the best product with the best team. And I think from that, things will follow.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to the question of we're here in Helsinki and the idea of growing from a small country to globally, what are the biggest challenges do you see now when you can get talents either coming to a small country or doing it over the internet, etc. What is the big challenge you see if you want to grow from a relatively small European country to go global?
One thing that's interesting in our report is showing that a lot of founders of the successful companies are serial entrepreneurs, but it doesn't mean that they've created big global success stories. I think many serial entrepreneurs were like myself. They maybe had a few companies that kind of failed, and they gave them a lot of experience, and then they have eventually this breakout company. But what that means is that these founding teams have very, very little experience how to scale a company. And they have very little experience, probably no experience, how to get into some of these huge markets, like the Asian markets, like China, Japan, Latin America, Southeast Asia. These are the growth markets. Over the next 5 years, we're going to have 1 billion more smartphones. And they're not going to come from Europe, they're not going to come from US, they're going to come from emerging markets. So it becomes increasingly important for companies to scale into countries where they have never been, maybe doing backpack there or something. And what's interesting is that while technology and technology platforms are changing so rapidly, how to do business in China, how to do business in Japan, Latin America is not really changing. So that's something that, as Atomico, we're trying to help companies get into those markets, and that's going to be a big lever effect. So that is one of the challenges we see companies having to how to scale into new markets.
So new markets, so you're saying that in 5 years' time you could skip the US and go to Asia Pac? I mean, is that possible?
I think it's very, very different for different type of companies. The reality is that, say 5 or say 10 years ago, it was or 15 years ago, it was all about going to the US. US is still the largest market in terms, or maybe the most important market, because that's where several of the big tech giants are located. However, if you look at the size of the Chinese market, the Japanese market, Southeast Asian market, and all those, they're much bigger market, much bigger markets. And so it's not trivial which is the first, if you're a kind of company from Helsinki, should you go east or should you go west, or should you go south? It's not like a trivial answer to that. And for many companies, it might be better to go east and to the emerging market before, so you can get strength before you're tackling the US markets. It's really hard actually to to successfully conquer the US market if you're a foreign company. So, and by the way, it's also really hard to get into China. So it's kind of the two most difficult markets. So it's about picking your right time to enter these markets when you have enough kind of momentum. If you go to these countries too early, it will kill you.
Great. Well, I think with that uplifting note, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much, Niklas.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.